He stood in the aisle, his gaze cold and his expression stony. The security sergeant at the airport paid no attention to the old man. Oh, despite his years, moved with dignity, the black-skinned elderly man was just walking up the gangway to board the plane. But everything changed when the guard approached him with a firm order. "You will not pass." He didn't know who the man was, but his skin color was reason enough to refuse. "You won't get through," the guard repeated with obvious disdain. And suddenly something happened that no one expected. But let's find out how it all ends. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. We really appreciate your support. You really help us grow and promote the channel. Your comments and likes are important to us, because thanks to you we keep doing what we love. Without you, nothing would be possible. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. The airport was filled with bustle. Passengers rushing to their flights were loudly discussing their plans, while the check-in counters were working like clockwork, accepting the next travelers. However, in the midst of this normal flow, there was a man who was the center of attention, but not by choice. Charles James, an elderly black man, moved toward the boarding gate, leaning on a stick, his steps measured but confident. He was dressed in a strict suit, worn boots, but a calm confidence shone on his face. Charles was on his way to an important endeavor, and though the years were felt on his shoulders, he wasn't about to let that stop him. He had just passed through security and was now heading to the gate for his flight to New York, where an important meeting awaited him. Charles lived with the idea that his life was full of obstacles, but he never gave up. Despite all the hardships, he held on with dignity. Across the hall stood Kyle Duncan, the airport security guard, with a look on his face like he'd just woken up on the wrong side of the bed. Kyle was middle-aged, slightly taller than average, and his body betrayed a habit of passive, immobile standing. He was stiff and unsociable, always with eyes full of displeasure and arrogance. When he noticed Charles, his gaze immediately became cold, assessing, as if drawing conclusions. That was the moment he decided that Charles should not go any further. For some reason, Kyle decided that this old man, was someone who didn't deserve to be around the other passengers. Without stopping, Kyle stepped forward and stood in the older man's path. He wasn't going to ask why he was in a hurry, and he had no intention of giving him a chance to explain himself. The man's problems, in the guard's opinion, were unimportant. Appearance, skin color, it all told him at once that Charles should not pass. That was his first thought. "I'm sorry, but you can't go any further," Kyle said with obvious contempt in his voice. He stepped closer, standing up, as if to personify his authority. His words were direct and clear, without the slightest hint of benevolence. Charles frowned, a little surprised. He looked at the guard with slight bewilderment, but despite his age, he didn't let his weakness get the better of him. He was used to such moments, because racism had always been a part of his life, but he had learned to ignore it. "What's the reason?" asked Charles, trying not to show how his words hurt. He was used to situations like this, but this time something was wrong. "None of your business," Kyle replied sharply, holding up a document. "I said don't come in." Charles tried to calmly explain that he had all the necessary documents and that he had to get on this flight, but Kyle didn't show the slightest interest in listening to the old man. His gaze did not hide his contempt, and with every word Charles said, his anger only grew stronger. "Don't you understand? I said I won't let you through. Do you have a problem with that?" he continued, as if every order he gave was law and the old man was just another object of humiliation. The guard's attitude was downright cruel. Kyle didn't just refuse to let Charles in. He did it with such fierce gloating, as if he was specifically trying to show his power over him. In his eyes, the old man was nothing more than a nuisance whose presence in this place was unnecessary. Charles continued on his way, his old body slightly bent from age, but filled with determination, moving towards the check-in counter. He had flown several times before, knew his paperwork was in order, and was only waiting for the standard check-in. He knew airports were tense places, where not only crowds of people, but also abrupt security officers could get on his nerves. But this time he hadn't expected that his encounter with the guard would turn into a real battle for his right to be here. He walked up to the counter with his passport in his hand, smiling at his imperceptible age. But when he looked up, he was met by the same guard Kyle. This man, with a grim expression and cruel gaze, stood at his post, not giving the slightest chance to pass. Charles tried to speak to him, but Kyle didn't even pay attention to his attempts. He was the only one standing between the old man and his flight, and now his intention was one thing: not to let Charles pass. Without asking, without inquiring, without giving any explanation, Kyle, as if he had received an order from on high, blocked the way. His voice was muffled and resolute, as if it were a non-negotiable sentence. He didn't raise his eyes, didn't even try to look at the papers Charles clutched in his hands. The guard was completely sure of his decision, and that no one dared to question his words. Charles frowned, his heart clenched at this gratuitous rejection. He was surprised, but a cold, deep anger was already brewing inside him. How could he be in this situation? He had fought injustice all his life, but this situation was particularly cruel for no reason. Without a hint of respect or understanding, he was simply refused entry. He tried to speak again, trying to get some logic out of the guard's actions. "My papers are all in order. Look, I'm just on my way to my flight." He held up his passport, his fingers trembling not from old age but from nervous tension. Charles knew the situation shouldn't go on like this, and something inside him was turning over with a sense of injustice. But Kyle didn't even look at the passport. He didn't seem to hear the old man's words. Absorbed in his own irritation and derision, the guard extended his hand, and there was something frightening in his eyes, not just aggression, but something deeper, elusive, and ruthless. He pushed the passport away from Charles, as if it were something dirty that didn't deserve attention. "I said, don't come through," he said even harder, even more confidently. He stepped forward, coming within inches of the old man. With every movement he made, the air in the airport grew heavier, and it seemed as if everyone around him began to slow down. The people around him, standing in line, were silent. It wasn't just silence, it was fear, a sense of anxiety that no one would dare to intervene. Kyle was on his own turf, and no one dared stop him. Charles felt his lungs constrict with fear, but it wasn't fear of the guard. It was fear for the fact that there were still people in this world for whom another person's skin was a reason for rejection, a reason for humiliation. He could feel Kyle's gaze as a pulsing hatred, as if he saw him not as a person but as a nuisance to be removed. "Why?" Charles asked quietly, and his voice became strangely husky. It wasn't a rhetorical question. He was searching for an answer in this nightmare. He tried to find at least some explanation for this humiliation, but the guard, not moving from his seat, left him without an answer. "None of your business," Kyle whispered again, his lips stretching into a barely perceptible smirk. And at that moment, Charles realized the conversation was over. The guard wasn't going to listen. He wasn't going to give a chance for an excuse. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a show of force, a confirmation of who is in charge. The elderly man remained standing, clutching his passport in his hands, a look of bitterness and disgust on his face. At that moment, it seemed to him that time had slowed down. He stood in front of a wall of incomprehension and contempt, and not a single word or look could break that barrier. Kyle turned around, as if deciding that his decision was finalized, and his face expressed complete satisfaction at the power he had just exerted. Charles felt his legs begin to tremble at what had just happened to him. This wasn't just humiliation. It was a real confrontation with a reality in which his skin color appeared to be the deciding factor that had nothing to do with his life, with his stories and experiences. And all around, as if they were forgotten witnesses to the event, people continued to move forward, silently observing what was happening, but no one intervened. Charles stood in front of Kyle, his hands clenched into fists and his heart beating so fast in his chest that it felt like it was about to burst out. But the old man tried not to show his inner storm. He knew that if you let fear and rage take over, you could lose your self-respect. He held himself with dignity, despite everything that was happening. But it wasn't just the pain of humiliation in his eyes. It was the deep resentment that was maturing in his soul. Kyle stood in front of him, unmoving, as if enjoying what was happening. His gaze wasn't just cold, it was drenched in outright hatred. The smile on his face was gone, but its trace remained. He knew that at this moment he had complete power, and that power was not limited to his position. It was something more. It was dominance, pride in his ability to suppress, to destroy. "You think I'm going to let people like you through?" Kyle said, his voice a little louder, more aggressive, as if he took pleasure in the very thought of humiliating a man. He took a step forward, causing Charles to instinctively back away. Each step he took seemed more and more threatening. "You're not like the people I usually deal with." he continued with a bright tinge of contempt, making no secret of his attitude. Charles tried to keep his composure, but the guard's words stabbed into his soul like knives. He realized they weren't just words. They were a manifestation of all the hatred Kyle had in his soul. All this time, Charles saw only one thing that was important to the guard, not his papers, not his rights as a passenger, just his color. Kyle continued, raising his voice, his words becoming more and more aggressive. "You think your black ass has a right to just walk into the boarding area?" His words carried a threat, a direct threat. "How many people like you have caused trouble in this world?" He grinned crookedly, making it clear that his contempt had no limits. He made no attempt at all to hide the fact that his decision was based on nothing but the fact that he just didn't want to let this old man in. Charles felt his chest constrict, but he wasn't going to back down. This moment was important not only to him, but to anyone who had ever faced this kind of humiliation. He could feel himself being overwhelmed from the inside by not just pain, but despair that his worth as a human being was measured only by the color of his skin. "What are you trying to prove?" Charles said quietly but confidently. He knew his words wouldn't immediately change the course of the situation, but not saying them would mean he'd given up. But Kyle only snorted in response, his face growing even angrier. "I'm not going to answer your questions, old black man," Kyle continued, and his voice took on an even crueler tone. It literally radiated contempt. "You think you're my equal here? You think I'm going to waste my time letting people like you through just because you want to fly to your..." He slowed his speech, searching for the offensive word. "To your black New York," he said, with obvious contempt. Every word Kyle spoke was like a hammer blow, driving this baseless racism deeper into the old man's heart. Charles clenched his teeth, not wanting to give this humiliation any more room. He could feel his hands starting to go numb, a coldness building up inside, but he held himself in check. He couldn't let the guard win at this point, otherwise everything he believed in would be meaningless. "You have no right to decide who deserves to be here." Charles felt his voice shake with increasing anger. He held himself back, but every word was now part of the fight for his honor. Kyle, however, didn't seem to hear. His face was contorted into a wicked grin, and with every word he said, every line he uttered became more explicit. "Are you out of your mind?" He spoke again, leaning in so close to Charles that his breath felt like a suffocating fog. "What makes you think you're so important? Anyway?" Charles held back a reply, but there was a fire burning in his eyes. It was more than just a desire to get on the plane. It was a fight for the right to be heard, for the right to be equal in front of other people, a right that Kyle seemed, at that moment, to want to take away. Charles stood, feeling his body tense to the limit. He knew that every movement, every word spoken in this situation could be decisive. He couldn't afford to give in at this moment, despite all the pain that seeped through every nerve he had. But despite his efforts, the guard continued his humiliation, not giving the slightest chance for an explanation. Kyle glared mockingly at Charles, each word increasing the distance between them not only physically, but mentally. His eyes expressed contempt, as if the mere fact that this man was around was already his personal victory. He wouldn't let Charles speak, wouldn't give him the slightest chance to explain, as if the old man didn't even deserve to hear his voice. "Who do you think you are?" Kyle spoke again, but he wasn't asking a question, rather continuing to lecture, as if Charles was nothing more than an object to be humiliated. He moved forward, nudging the old man in the back, not giving him a chance to back up even a little. All the while, the guard avoided direct eye contact, as if Charles had no right to human attention. Charles tried to appeal again to his right, the right to be treated fairly and with respect. "I'm asking you, I have to get on this flight. I have a meeting, and His voice sounded muffled and restrained, but it had no effect whatsoever. Kyle just shook his head, as if to ignore everything he was saying, and in that moment Charles felt a growing helplessness, as if his words didn't exist for this guard. "Don't mess me with your problems, black man," Kyle interrupted, slipping his weapon off his shoulder as if preparing for the next move that would put Charles in his place. The guard moved with a slight aggression, as if he was certain that every gesture was his way of punishing the old man for his presence. He glanced at Charles, then deflected again, as if he were trying to portray him as someone in his life who shouldn't even be socialized with. Every gesture Kyle made became more and more demeaning. He didn't just ignore Charles. He did everything he could to make it clear that he had no right to even be around him. When Charles, trying to regain his strength, came to the counter several times, offering his papers. Kyle didn't even look at them, making it clear that the old man didn't deserve any attention. His words were short, as if they were not addressed to a man, but to something less than a man. He simply ignored all of Charles' attempts to explain anything. It wasn't just concern or fatigue, it was a deliberate, cold ignoring, as if Charles had no right to exist in this place at all. Charles felt his shoulders begin to give in under the weight of this situation. Words were useless when met with such a wall of defiance. He was old, but that was enough to realize that this guard didn't just want to stop him and wanted to humiliate him. It was brutal. It was personal. There wasn't the slightest interest in the old man's story or his need to get on the flight in his eyes. There was only one motive in Kyle's eyes to prove that this man was lower than himself, and that his existence here was irrelevant. And so, when Charles tried to say something again, Kyle interrupted him with one swift, dismissive wave of his hand. "Shut up and back off," he shouted, not caring that people were already starting to gather in the hall. They seemed to be expecting someone to intervene, someone to say that this was wrong, but no one actually dared. This moment was like a test of silence, like a test of how long people could tolerate watching such humiliation without doing anything. Charles felt his legs begin to weaken, but a fire burned in his eyes. He couldn't let this guard win, couldn't let him humiliate himself like this. There had been too much in his life that he had endured to give up so easily. But this situation was different. Everything that was happening was like a flash of pain, like a desire to latch onto something more important than this moment. The situation was getting more tense by the second. Charles stood with his teeth clenched, trying to maintain some dignity in front of this guard, who continued not only to ignore him, but also to humiliate him, not even allowing him to say a word. But even more frightening was the fact that the people around him, standing in line, were watching what was happening like spectators in a stadium, but no one dared to intervene. All this time Charles felt a heavy silence growing around him, in which there was not the slightest attempt to help him. The people, as if shackled by fear, continued to stand there, silently watching what was happening. There was an eerie silence in the airport hall, broken only by the sounds of distant footsteps and muffled conversations, unrelated to what was happening here. In front of everyone's eyes, people were standing in line, a little farther away from the front desk, but they were all witnesses to this humiliation. Some men and women, as soon as they heard the guard's harsh words, began to quickly glance at each other, as if trying to figure out what to do. But no one moved. No one approached Charles. No one tried to intervene. And though the noise in the hall was not loud, everything around them felt as if it were in some nightmarish fog. A heavy, heavy silence that squeezed everyone. Some raised their heads and quickly looked away when their gazes crossed the guards. They tried to ignore what was happening, as if they were strangers to the conflict, hoping that it would somehow resolve itself, that the guard would calm down or the old man would back off. But with each moment that Kyle became more aggressive and Charles continued to stand without giving up, fear crept into the hearts of these men, causing them to lose themselves in silence. Charles noticed one woman at the end of the line pressing her lips together, clearly embarrassed, but she never stepped forward. She looked at the guard, then at the old man, but her gaze quickly slipped to the floor, and she shrank back as if trying not to draw attention to herself. It was scary. She had an expression in her eyes, as if she herself was afraid of the consequences, afraid that if she interfered, something bad for her would follow. Some of the men standing nearby began to whisper, their heads leaning toward each other, but the words did not reach Charles. They were discussing what had happened, but no one dared to intervene. They seemed to feel a rising tide of tension encompassing them, like an invisible force that just wouldn't let them side with the old man. It was as if the guard himself was more than just a man standing at his post. It was a symbol of power, and that power was silencing people, making them retreat. Charles could feel the air around him getting heavier and heavier, and the eyes of the people turning around became more and more frightened. His shoulders began to give in under this silence. He could hear the quiet whispers around him, but there was nothing he could do. It was humiliation, not only from Kyle, but from the silence of those around him. Charles didn't know what was scarier, the guard himself with his rage and racism, or this creeping fear in the eyes of people who dared not act, dared not intervene because they were afraid of the consequences. It wasn't just a lack of support, it was fear. Fear of the guard, of his power, of what might happen if anyone risked disrupting the order. Fear that they themselves might become the next targets of his aggression. if they dared to stand up and intervene. Some started whispering among themselves, but the words were too quiet for anyone to hear. They were phrases like, "It's not right. Why is he doing this to him?" But they couldn't have been more hollow than they were, because nobody dared to stand up and do anything. No one tried to stand up for the truth. No one tried to denounce the racism that was right in front of them. This fear wasn't just fear of the guard. It was fear of power. Fear that even if they intervened, their lives would be ruined. And that fear was in every look, every movement, every whisper. Charles stood alone, and in that moment he realized all these people here, beside him, could have made a difference, but instead of helping, they were victims of their own fears, anxiety and inaction. And the fact was far more painful to him than the guard's words. Each of Kyle's next words hit Charles's nerves like a hammer. The guard stood before him with a confident look, as if he had no doubt in his mind that he was right. It seemed that every step he took, every movement of his body, was fueled solely with pride in his power, in the fear he was already sowing into the air around him. He was the master of the situation, and Charles, in spite of his honest papers, seemed to him no more than a punching bag. Kyle, standing directly in front of the old man, spread his arms out to the sides, as if squaring his shoulders, and spoke sharply, "Show me the other papers." His voice was harsh, without the slightest tinge of sympathy or understanding. Charles made another attempt to get his papers, predicting in advance that they would be in vain, but his actions did not arouse the guard's interest in the slightest. He knew that Charles had all the necessary documents with him, that all their data had been checked, and did not raise any questions. But that didn't matter to Kyle. "You didn't think you could get through so easily," the guard continued, pulling away and folding his arms across his chest. His face took on an expression, as if it had just caught Charles cheating. "I need more proof that you have any right to get on this plane at all." He blinked, as if pulling Charles away from reality. It was all just to add another step of humiliation to this chain of harassment. Charles was stunned. He knew they had everything in order: tickets, passport, everything. He was prepared and had checked everything beforehand, but not for Kyle. The guard kept brazenly demanding additional documents, which he seemed to have some special, unspecified interest in. "What? You think I'm just going to let you go?" The question wasn't so much a question. It was a statement. Kyle wasn't asking. He was demanding, "You don't even deserve to sit in this room." Charles tried to keep his composure. He realized that any action, any show of emotion in his direction would only put water on the guard's mill. He slowly pulled out all of his papers, folding them neatly in front of the guard. The documents were in order. All the requirements had been met. He didn't have to prove anything. But Kyle wasn't satisfied. He took the papers and began checking them slowly, with a kind of soulless, agonizing scrutiny, as if he were looking for the slightest mistake that just wasn't there. Every glance at the papers, every movement of them in Kyle's hands was a humiliation. Charles felt his body clench again with fear and anger, but he held himself in check, knowing that even a weak reaction could lead to more humiliation. The guard took his time. He turned each sheet slowly, pretending to look for something invisible. He didn't pay attention to the fact that all the documents were perfect for him. It was just part of the game, part of the process of humiliating the old man. Kyle waved his hand toward the passport, his eyes sliding over the page mockingly, as if Charles was hiding something on purpose. "I don't think you need all this," he said, turning the passport over and over again with obvious contempt. His every word was like a spit, his every movement like a hint that to the guard Charles was a nobody, and that his efforts, his age, his papers meant nothing. In this momentary picture of power and dominance, Charles was only an element to be rejected. Charles felt his face lose all color. He stood there, clenching his fists, but there was nothing he could do. He knew that Kyle was continuing to humiliate him, not for making a mistake, not for breaking the rules, but simply for being who he was. It was more painful than any other humiliation in his life. Kyle kept going through the paperwork, not giving the old man a chance. He could have just handed the paperwork back and led him on the flight, but no. Instead, he stalled, questioning every document, every move Charles made to increase his power, to feel like he was in control. Every movement of the guard was like a taunt. Every look, every gesture was just a way of saying that he was deciding that this old man, this black old man, would not be allowed to go along with his plans. He was in the game, and Charles was only a pawn in that game. Kyle raised his head again, his eyes blazing. You didn't think I'd check out all the stuff you brought?" Charles stood before him, all confused but inwardly determined. Every nervous breath he took was because the guard wasn't just continuing to humiliate him. He was doing it with insane confidence, enjoying the process. Charles was on the verge of a breakdown. He felt every word. The guard spoke like a scalding iron digging into his soul. But worst of all was what he knew. All of this was not just an accident, not just a chance encounter between two people. This was systemic humiliation, an attitude that the guard had instilled not only in him, but in everyone who would ever be in his position. The respect issues weren't just with him. They were part of a deeper problem that was becoming more prominent by the day. With every move Kyle made, every question he asked, Charles felt his inner world shrinking, his dignity and sense of self-importance beginning to crumble like sand through his fingers. Kyle wasn't just refusing to respect him, he was showing his contempt openly, as if to show that to him, the old man was just a dot on the path that he could proudly walk past without looking back. Kyle said with another sneer, looking at Charles as if he were someone who didn't even deserve to look at his face. "Does anyone even want you, old man?" he added, clearly showing his disrespect for everything. Charles was in the guard's eyes. It wasn't just contempt in his words, it was an outright attack on human dignity. As if he were saying that old age, combined with black skin, had no right to respect in this world. Charles felt his heart clench with pain. He was exhausted not only physically, but mentally as well. This wasn't just a humiliation because of his age or race, it was an attack on everything he had ever known about himself as a human being. He'd lived a long life full of struggles, victories and defeats, but he'd never felt so devalued. Every word Kyle spoke seemed to lash out with renewed vigor, like a hammer blow to his dignity. But despite all these words and threats, Charles tried to keep his composure. It was hard, even painful. He knew that if he showed even the slightest weakness now, his humiliation would only increase. He couldn't let the guard, this man who saw him as nothing, see that his words were getting through. He couldn't allow himself to give in. He was old, but still a man with dignity to protect. He clenched his teeth, trying not to be provoked. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to hold out the papers again, despite the fact that the guard had already looked them over repeatedly. All the while, he was in increasing pain, but Charles couldn't afford to collapse. "Stay calm," he told himself. "You can't give up now. You've lived this long. You're tough. You know how to take it." However, even with all his efforts, Charles felt his strength running out. He was on the brink, but he still stood. It wasn't so much fear that tormented his soul as it was disrespect. It was the poison that seemed to be seeping into his every cell. Kyle didn't just disbelieve in his rights. He didn't recognize Charles himself as a human being, didn't think he was worthy of respect or even consideration. The situation became even more painful when Charles realized that this attitude on the part of the guard was not casual. It was not just a manifestation of personal aggression. It was the result of the way Charles was perceived in society as someone whose dignity could be ignored, who could be treated like nothing. All these years, all his experiences seemed to have no meaning to Kyle. His age, his skin color, all of it became just a tool to deny him the most basic right of all, the right to respect. "He doesn't think of me as a person," Charles thought painfully. "To him, I'm just a figure who isn't worth a single glance from him." That realization was a hard blow, but he couldn't let himself give up. Even in such humiliation, even in such tyranny, he knew he had to remain human, no matter what. But the longer this torture went on, the harder it became for him to contain his inner fear. Charles stood stiffly, his eyes full of fatigue and resentment. He could already feel his soul crumbling with every rejection, with every humiliation the guard shamelessly inflicted on him. But his face, though covered with wrinkles and signs of years of struggle, could not hide the pain that enveloped him with every word uttered by this guard. Every action of his was like a bullet piercing his heart, every word like a poisonous arrow destroying his inner world. Charles tried to hold back his tears, clenching his jaw and closing his eyes to keep the guard from seeing how much pain he was in. He knew that if he showed even the slightest weakness, the guard would only get the satisfaction of having managed to break him. But his body could no longer hide what was going on in his soul. His lips trembled, and despite his best efforts, his eyes still began to fill with tears, which he held back with difficulty. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a destructive blow to his very existence, a blow that racism inflicted. He felt like all his years, his whole life, All his trials, his joys and sorrows were nullified in an instant by this guard. To Kyle, he was just a man not worthy of respect, not worthy of normal treatment. Charles was nothing more than an element to be thrown away, pushed aside like unwanted trash. Each rejection from the guard became a deeper wound. "You can't pass." That phrase sounded louder and louder in Charles's head, like a sentence. His heart was beating faster, his chest was getting tight, and he could feel the fear filling his mind. What will happen if he can't get through? What will happen if he never gets on this plane? These questions drove his thoughts to a standstill. But even worse was the fact that each rejection became more and more heartbreaking. He could see the crowd gathering around him, and though they were silent, their eyes reflected not sympathy, but rather curiosity and the expectation that it would be the same as before, that the man would give in. It was especially painful because Charles knew that if he were white, if his face and skin color were different, no one would question his right to board. But to Kyle, to this guard, he was just a black old man, a man to do with as it pleased. The color of his skin was the cause of his suffering, his powerlessness. Racism was in every letter, every look, every word uttered by the guard. And these consequences, the consequences of racism, penetrated his soul like a poisonous weed that kills everything living around it. Charles couldn't afford to give up, but there was fear in his eyes now. Fear not that he wouldn't pass the controls, but that the world he lived in was so unfair. This fear wasn't just internal, it had become part of his reality. It was a fear of power that subjugates, of a system that makes people like him unworthy. It was fear that he would never be heard, that his pain would remain invisible to everyone but himself. He clenched his fists, trying to hold back the torrent of emotion that seemed about to burst forth. He couldn't afford to be weak, couldn't afford to show the guard how much his words hurt, but the pain was already so deep that it was impossible not to feel it. Every time, the guard said again and again that Charles could not pass. And so, at this moment, as he tried to hold back the last vestiges of his pride, Charles felt his body sink heavily. He felt, more than ever before, that he was just a figure, helpless and powerless, to be thrown out into the street like an unwanted weight. He had been through so much in life, struggled so much for his place in the sun, but in that moment, he realized how fragile human life and dignity is. These moments when everyone turns away from you, when you feel that your skin color determines your place in society, these are the consequences of racism. It was then that Charles realized that not everyone is equal, that those who are supposed to protect the rights of others may in fact be the ones who destroy them. It was at that moment that it became clear to him that the wounds that racism inflicts can stay with you for life, and they are more painful than ever. When Charles had almost given up all hope, when his soul was at its breaking point and he felt that he could not endure this humiliation any longer, an unexpected event was the turning point. At the very moment when the guard seemed to have finally made up his mind and the situation was almost over, something changed, something that immediately made Kyle think, stopped his stream of derogatory words and glances. The man standing next to Charles was a well-known one. It was a personality whose name instantly changed the entire context of what was happening. The guard, absorbed in his indifferent aggression, took his eyes off the old man for a moment. He squinted at Charles's companion, his eyes first becoming slightly strained, then frowning in anticipation, as if something in his mind had finally clicked. Charles noticed the guard falter for a second. His gaze shifted sharply to the man standing next to him, and suddenly the confidence with which he had been dictating terms began to falter. The guard looked Charles over again, then turned back to his companion, and there was a flicker of some confusion in his eyes. Charles realized that something important was happening now, something that could change the entire course of events. Though he thought the situation had slipped completely out of his hands, the guard's sudden attention to his companion, not to him, could not have been accidental. He saw Kyle's gaze shift, his confidence giving way for a moment to a kind of confused confusion. The guard said, as if trying to regain his confidence. His voice, which had sounded so confident before, was now more cautious, as if he sensed something was wrong. He looked at the man beside Charles, trying to remember if he'd seen or heard him anywhere. The tone of her conversation with Charles changed instantly. It changed from cruel and mocking to more attentive and cautious. The guard, who until then had literally ignored the old man, now couldn't take his eyes off his companion. The look of suspicion was now mixed with a kind of respect, and even submissiveness that had not and could not have been there a moment ago. Charles could feel the tension in the air change. His companion, still until that moment completely unnoticed in this context, was not just a man, but a personality whose name changed everything at once. He could be not only a powerful man, but a personality whose presence here was going to change the whole picture of what was happening. Hence the guard's reaction. His eyes now read not aggression, but rather uncertainty. Even the one who had controlled the situation with iron grip now felt that he was confused. Charles knew who was standing next to him. That companion, the man who could have been the one everyone recognized, was now the one who had suddenly caught the guard's attention. This man's name could be the magic card that would change the accents that had been placed. The companion was an important person, and his presence was obviously what destroyed the picture of overbearing injustice the guard had constructed. He realized that the guard would never have behaved this way if he had known who he was dealing with. The man next to Charles was silent. His face was calm, but his presence clearly changed the atmosphere around him. At that moment, Charles realized how much a person's perception depends on status, on name and social status. There was no need to say anything. The very fact that there was a man next to him who was known, significant, suddenly made the guard look at what was happening in a different way. Now his aggression and rudeness began to fade. His gaze, instead of being filled with contempt, became wary, even as if apologetic. He stopped looking at Charles as a faceless figure. The situation had changed abruptly, and it was a clear signal to the guard that his usual actions, his dominance in this situation, were being questioned. The guard's thoughtfulness was growing. He may have realized by now that the behavior he was engaging in. As the guard continued to study Charles's companion, his eyes gradually filled with confusion, and the confidence with which he had just addressed the older man began to melt away. There was a look of genuine shock on his face, as if the whole world around him had collapsed. He began to realize who he was dealing with, and suddenly his own reality, which he had so confidently built, began to crack at the seams. At first, Kyle looked like a man standing confidently in his position. He was a guard, a man whose only duty was to maintain order, and who thought he could decide the fate of others based on his superiority. But now that his gaze locked on Charles's companion, the situation changed instantly. A confusion flashed in his eyes that was so obvious it could not be ignored. He felt his body grow heavy, as if it were suddenly out of control, and his mind was filled with doubt. Kyle could barely get the words out. His voice shook. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable a few minutes ago, seemed to be shattered by the storm. Charles, sensing the change in the atmosphere, smiled faintly, but the pain and weariness on his face still remained. His gaze never left the guard, who was now clearly going through an internal crisis. That companion, who had remained in the background until this point, finally became the center of attention. This was a man whose name alone was familiar to most, a man Kyle knew from rumors and perhaps even saw in the news. His face was no longer like any other passengers, and his presence now left no room for doubt. "You didn't know who I was?" Charles' companion asked calmly, without changing his tone, but his words were full of cold analysis of the situation. He knew that this moment was important, that now he was the one who could change the course of events, but it didn't press the guard too hard. There was no anger in his voice, just a clear understanding that the very fact that he was here already meant more than anything Kyle had said. At this point, the guard began to realize that his behavior towards Charles was not only unprofessional, but potentially dangerous to himself. He probably still couldn't believe that he was confronted with a man he shouldn't be insulting, humiliating, or neglecting. He knew who stood before him. It was a famous businessman, a public figure, perhaps even someone whose actions could have an impact on Kyle's own reputation and career. A fleeting thought flashed through the guard. What if this man decided to sue him for his behavior? Kyle swallowed, his breathing hitched and his face pale. All confidence vanished, replaced by worry and fear of the consequences of his action. He now realized that even if he didn't immediately recognize the fact of who he was facing, delaying could cost him so much more. He could lose his job, his reputation, and possibly face more serious consequences for this behavior. The guard was beginning to feel fear gripping his mind, and he didn't know how to come out of this with dignity. The man standing next to Charles was not just an ordinary passenger. He was an important figure, a man whose name could shake the foundations of the entire airport. The guard now realized that his racist behavior and aggression throughout this encounter might not only be unacceptable, but catastrophic to himself. I'll need to contact my superiors, Kyle squeezed out, his voice soft, almost timid now. His pride and self-confidence, which he had displayed so fiercely earlier, dissolved like mist in the morning sun. He looked at Charles' companion and began to realize that he had encountered something that could not be ignored. This wasn't just a personal encounter, this was a moment that could change his life. Charles remained silent, his gaze unchanged. He realized that what was happening now was not just his victory, but a symbol of the power of justice in a world where racism and prejudice often go unpunished. He knew that this moment was important to him, but even more important to everyone who has ever suffered prejudice and hatred. The guard stood stiffly, his heart pounding in his chest, his every breath heavy and nervous. He tried to collect his thoughts, but his mind was in a storm. An hour ago, he had been sure that he was right. The certainty of his actions seemed immutable. He had felt that he could command people, that his power and authority were great enough to dictate terms. But now that he realized what he was up against, his world had crumbled. He searched for words that might somehow remedy the situation, but none of them could bring back what had already been said. All his efforts, all the threats and cruel demands he had made upon the elderly Charles, now seemed to him a burden that could not be lifted. The guard looked at Charles' companion again, feeling a new weight on his shoulders, the weight of realizing the consequences. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. Kyle tried to justify himself, but his voice sounded helpless. He didn't know how to regain a modicum of dignity after what had happened. He realized that his words no longer mattered, that his actions were out in the open, and his life might never be the same. "What are you going to do, guard?" Charles' companion asked calmly, his gaze cold, but there was no anger in it. It was the look of a man who had seen far more in life than the guard himself could ever imagine. He knew it was important for Kyle to realize now that the consequences of his prejudice would not only be personal, but public as well. The guard took a deep breath and tried to straighten up, trying to regain some of his lost confidence. But it wasn't enough. His eyes were panic-stricken, his face pale, and he could feel how his own behavior now raised questions he could not answer. Every movement he made, every attempt to justify himself, seemed artificial and insincere. All he could do was shrug, trying to come up with an explanation that he felt might assuage his guilt just a little. You don't understand. I'm just doing my job," the guard mumbled, but his words sounded hollow, like an excuse. He didn't believe himself. He already realized that his excuses wouldn't matter in the eyes of others. No one would believe that his actions were a mistake. They were the result of years of habit, deeply ingrained in his behavior. Now that the whole incident was starting to attract the attention of other passengers, the guard realized that his position of authority no longer existed. People were starting to look at him with judgment. Some were uncomfortable, some were just waiting for the situation to end. But every look, every whisper behind their backs was starting to be evidence of his failure. Charles stood silent, his face tired but not aggressive. He knew he didn't need to yell or apologize now. All he needed was to see the guard realize his mistake. The guard now realized that this moment would change his life. Even if he tried to learn from what had happened, it was clear to him that he had already crossed the line, and now the question was not how to fix it, but what would happen to him next. Turning to his superiors, the guard tried to speak confidently again, but his speech was different. He did not know how this incident would be handled, did not know how he would live after the entire airport and all the passengers had witnessed him violating the basic principles of respect and humanity. Somewhere deep in his soul, a feeling of shame began to arise that he could not immediately realize, but it had already begun to spread through his heart, burning his every action. Charles and his companion were silent, but each of them knew that their silence spoke far more than any words. The silence at that moment was not just a reticence. It was a symbol that the situation had changed, that it could not be forgotten and could not be remedied by easy words. It was a moment for the security guard to realize that every choice he makes, every word he says does not go unchallenged, and that even small acts like denying service because of racial bias can have huge consequences. Now Kyle could no longer just live his life as he had before. He wasn't just a guard. He was a person who had made a mistake, and the mistake had changed everything he knew about himself and the world around him. This moment was a turning point not only for Kyle himself, But for everyone who witnessed the incident, the sight of what happened, though quiet, still vividly reflected how easily people can forget about justice, succumbing to their personal beliefs, fear, or just a trivial habit of prejudice. It was a lesson that was hard to ignore. The guard standing in front of the elderly black man was no longer the man who moments ago had considered his authority unquestionable. Now his worries were so obvious that it was impossible not to be penetrated by them. The passengers, some quietly whispering, some watching the situation with tense faces, began to realize that this moment was much more important than just an argument at the airport. It was a real lesson that showed how small actions taken based on preconceived notions and stereotypes can lead to devastating consequences not only for the victim, but for the decision maker himself. The guard's every look, every gesture was full of pride, and his confidence in his own actions vanished like smoke. Some of the passengers in the queue began to murmur, realizing that what they were seeing was not just two people fighting, but a clash between real power and what lies behind that power. Some began to realize how difficult it can often be to confront one's own inner beliefs and habits, and how often the system of oppression works in such a way that all of its components become blind and impersonal. Only a small change was needed and everything changed. Justice in this context could have been instantaneous had the guard not succumbed to his stereotypes. The guard, seeing how his actions were beginning to cause noticeable unease among the people, felt fear that his behavior had now become an example to others, fear that it had become a symbol of bias, and all his words had become empty. And perhaps most importantly, he now understood that those who had not intervened, those who had not raised their voices in defense of Charles, were no less guilty of this acquiescence that so easily turns into majority silence. Every face that now looked at him was filled with sympathy, judgment, and sometimes fear. The guard, who stood at the center of attention, suddenly felt his own power losing strength. He realized that he had lost not only the opportunity to keep his job, but also the respect of those who should have seen him as a defender of order, not a symbol of oppression. Charles' gaze was full of calm judgment, but not anger. He knew that his actions were not just a victory over the guard, but a chance for everyone around him to realize the importance of acting with wisdom and humanity. Even when you seemed to be outnumbered, he knew that this moment would change not only his life, but the lives of those around him. Charles felt that this lesson would now become part of a larger story that people would remember for a long time. Though the guard tried to justify himself, his attempts couldn't bring back the confidence he had before. The moment he realized his mistake, and even his voice became weakened and confused, there was a feeling in the air that he wasn't the only person who needed to learn this lesson. Things have changed. Injustice became apparent. Passengers began to realize that all of their views on what was happening did not have to be as quiet and indifferent. This moment was the lesson that broke down the walls built of habitual stereotypes and preconceived notions. And though the guard still stood there, weakly excusing himself, everyone knew that he was no longer the same man he had been before this meeting. In his place, perhaps there was another man, someone who could realize that there were things in the world that were more important than personal convictions. In a world where justice often depends on those who dare to speak their minds, it is important to always remember that true strength lies in choosing respect over prejudice. That moment was a lesson that people may never forget, a lesson that was important not only to Kyle, but to everyone around him, who realized in that moment how easy it is to find yourself in a position where real power becomes an empty sound and justice is something that fades into the shadows if you remain silent when you need to speak. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How have you reacted in such situations? We are very interested in your opinion, and we look forward to your comments. You are incredibly important to us, and each and every one of you is valuable. It is thanks to you that we continue to grow and develop our channel. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new interesting videos. We wish you a good day. May it be filled with kindness, respect, and warmth.